Welcome to Carolina Tradewinds Local Voices radio program. I'm your host, Ken Morgan, and today we have Warren Green. He writes articles for the Albemarle Tradewinds magazine about local produce, cancer, and growing organic foods in our area. Why don't you introduce yourself, Warren?
I write a column for the Albemarle Tradewinds, health and nutrition strategies for cancer survivors and everybody else. I'm a cancer survivor. I was diagnosed in 2005. And when I located Northeast North Carolina, I did a prostate cancer support group for the American Cancer Society. And after 2 or 3 years, in and out, I got an opportunity to start writing for my friend Ken and Scott Perry in the Albemarle Tradewinds, and it gave me a chance to expand my platform and to talk to a lot of my support group and even more. And it got so big that we were talking about exclusively cancer. But then it got to the point where we talked about cancer and everybody else because I'm seeing it was the same problem. So with that, I'll talk a little bit about my background and how I got to this point because I think that's very important. My mother, Northeast North Carolina, has been our homestead, and we go back about 5 generations. My mother left Northeast North Carolina in 1937. And I got into the world in 1939. She located to New York City, and that's where I started life. I joined the United States Navy in 1956. I got out. I went to, kicked around like most veterans do when you get out. You have no idea. In 1960, it's all kind of turmoil in the country. Everything's happening in the country. I started working for New York City Department of Hospitals, and I worked there for maybe almost 10 years, working on it as an EMT, actually. It wasn't called an EMT at that time. They were called ambulance attendants. I got a good idea of how medicine works. And after I tired of that, I think my ambulance got firebombed in the Bronx. I said, well, let me get out of here. This is not my kind of job, I don't think. I started working for the United States Postal Service. That kind of worked. And in New York. And from there, I located to Indiana with my family in the post office still, came back in the post office to New York. And there I saw an article in the paper, one of the local tabloids, I think it was the Daily News, that they were looking for people with either military black background or police background to initiate meat inspection in New York City, New York State meat inspection in New York City. Prior to that, the inspection was all upstate and nothing was in New York City. That was something that I guess they didn't want to tackle. So that sounded perfect for me. What a great job. So I applied and I got the job. And we were trained and took us up to Albany to train us about inspection, gave us the rules and regulations and gave us a little chemistry and labs and so forth, and then put us out on the street in New York City. Now, the job was to go into some of these plants, small mom and pop plants that were manufacturing sausage and pastrami and doing all these kind of things, began inspection to them. Let them know that they're now regulated by New York State, and here were the rules and regulations that they had to follow. And that went pretty good. Some of the places I inspected included Big Paulie Castellano with in the Gambino family. He had a meat plant and five supermarkets that he serviced, and so it was okay. And I loved the job. New York City, after 5 years, New York State decided that they were going to discontinue their program and turn it over to the USDA, because in New York State you couldn't transport, if you were under New York State inspection, for instance, you couldn't service people in New Jersey across the river, or in Connecticut, across the border. So they turned it over to New York State, to the USDA, and we were absorbed. I wound up in upstate New York. Upstate New York began my whole thing in rural areas of this country because I had being an urban kid to it was a big culture change to located and working in rural New York with poultry plants and blah, blah, blah. But I loved it, and that became my passion was to do that. I worked in the Binghamton, Johnson City, and Endicott area, or Vestal up in the Tri-City area, they call it in New York. And they had a water problem that they have frequently all over where they'll announce that you need to boil your water before you use it and so forth and so on. That I had plants that were operating during that time, and I stopped the production, and that's all you can do in the USDA is to stop the production. There's no recall. We have no recall authority, so we could just stop the production, and I did. I retained the product. They sent it to the lab and everything else. Further down the line, I applied for some jobs down there, and fortunately enough, I wound up working in Washington, which was in the administration. That went very well. I was working for the Food Safety Inspection Service in Washington in the Standards and Labeling Division. And standards and labeling at the time is everything. That's how what the standard is for food, what the expectation is of what a product is, like, say, a pork and beans. Well, that kind of is generally grandfather in products like that. In pork and beans, and that's not a USDA inspected product, by the way, even though pork is the first article in the name. It's just pork and beans is just an accepted name. What 3% is the threshold for a product that's going to be inspected by the USDA. And if it has less than 3%, that's it. And interestingly enough, and I'll get into beef because I think I wrote about beef in this ground beef in my latest article. But I'll get back to that because that's really significant with ground beef and hamburger particularly. But I did very well there. I guess personality-wise, I kind of worked. I had a good crew. It was a small little group, but we were actually making the standards and making the regulations for all of the package. In fact, most of the meat marketed in the United States, which is astounding when you see that this little group had that much control over the food chain. It worked I did very well there, and I ascended to a supervisory position, and we started looking, and I started and wound up that I started writing some of the regulations and our operating manuals and so forth and so on. And I talk about that, and a lot of what I talk about is extracted. I extract and use in my articles, and so I can refer people to read my articles and to get the specific details and some of the sources that I use, like Code of Federal Regulations, the Federal Register, and everything else, and how we construct the rules and the regulations. And finally, I wrote safe handling and food safe handling. Mm-hmm. Just before I retired in the 90s, I wrote the safe handling instructions for our operating manuals for the people that work for me. And one of the label people came in with the label with that on it. But they had appealed National Grocers Association because they were not interested in that information being on the label. They didn't think it was necessary. And of course I did. And it was this how to handle raw meat, and what you should do to protect yourself from the problems with raw meat, how to cook it, how to handle it, how to disinfect it, how everything else. And that was it. That was probably my last official act. I approved that, and it happened that, in general, I did not have approval authority. It happened to be, I think, Good Friday. Most people in Washington were off. I was probably the highest ranking person in management in food safety, and I approved it. But a court order came to, I forget the word, to stop. Yeah. And I just went on and approved it, and now it's common all over. It's expected every place else in them. And soon after that, in '96 or '97, I retired. I thought it was just I didn't understand the direction that the USDA or the Food Safety Inspection Service was going. Prior to that, if you see any of my articles, I am a HACCP trained supervisor, trainer. And HACCP is more critical control points is a situation where they're giving the plants more and more responsibility for the food and critical control points. I don't agree with that. I thought the inspection a little more hands on, and and primarily because the manufacturers or the producers are as conscientious. That's a good word. Are as conscientious as people that are there to protect the public. Right. The manufacturers tend to be more profit oriented when they're lobbied and so forth and so on. And when you consider the nature of the product, particularly meat, we have a meat that's has to be preserved to get to wherever it's going to get. Right. Meat might have a shelf. If it's frozen, it might last a while, or if it's there. But meat has a shelf, depending upon the shelf life, it's not shelf stable. So they have to use some sort of preservative to keep it wholesome. Mm-hmm. I don't want to. Wholesome is not a good word, but to keep it from spoiling, sure, before it reaches the public. Mm-hmm. And the substances that they use for that is usually toxic in itself. Stuff like sodium nitrite, sodium nitrate, it's toxic. BHA, BHT, that's toxic. So you have decomposing meat that's preserved by a toxic chemical.
Right, and that's where the cancer stuff comes in that you always are talking about in your columns.
Yeah. So now we have so the whole environment is toxic, and it's getting more and more toxic. And I've almost pinpointed how my cancer came about. I think it came from dairy, mm-hmm. and I'll say that. And there was a time that I've always been lactose intolerant, like most of the world. Well, you're intolerant because dairy isn't something that an adult needs. Dairy is specifically for offspring of mammals. What we have now is in '96, the USDA allowed bovine growth hormones into dairy cows to increase meat production, increase milk production. And it did by 30%. But now we're getting growth hormones in the food chain. And extra milk production cause inflammation with the cows. So to mitigate that, they use antibiotics. So now we have hormones and antibiotics getting into the food chain, and it's marketed by the federal government because we're talking about milk and cheese, and they market that to our children and so forth. And you can see the results in pre-adolescence. Adolescence is kind of advanced. You have young boys with facial hair and growing, and my God, they're 5 inches taller than their parents at 13. Yeah. Well, that's all. You're getting bovine growth chemicals into the body. They're not allowed. Our dairy cattle is not allowed to be sold in places like Canada or the UK and most places in the world. They won't take it. They don't want it with the chemicals. So what they do is they sell it at a lower rate in the fast food area, like McDonald's, Wendy's. That's where you get your dollar hamburgers and so forth, and sliders or whatever they want to call it, and that's where you have. So, and then they market that to our children, and here's what we have.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting this month, you wrote in the Albemarle Tradewinds, was she was talking about beef hearts are now allowed to be put in hamburgers. Is that correct?
Yes.
Could you give some background on that?
And that's really interesting. as I said, I started out as an inspector in New York State. We called beef hearts were byproducts, and they were never allowed. A butcher wouldn't even put it in. And I put pink slime in the same category. That's partially defatted chopped beef, where they take the bones and put them through a machine and centrifuge them, and they have knives and stuff that will extract some of the meat that they can get off, and then heat it up, and then they'll freeze it, they'll treat it and freeze it, and they'll add that to the meat. They allowed that to be called beef as opposed to what it was, and particularly a school lunch. Then they called it, and it could be chopped beef. So therefore, because it could be called chopped beef, it could be identified as beef. And the same thing with hearts. Hearts were never allowed in ground beef. In fact, ground beef was it used to be one of the premier products, but allowing like beef hearts and at any limit without identification. That's my issue, is that now it's allowed, and they said that they had erred 40 years ago, and it was misinterpreted. Most butchers now won't do it. However, I don't know how they're going to compete when their competitors will use it. And that's what usually happens. And a good example of that happened with ham. I remember when cured ham never had water added. I remember some excellent products that were nice and juicy and only had the natural juices. And then they started adding fluids at 10%, 20% water, and they marketed it as more juicy and so forth and so on. Well, sooner or later, they drove the people that made the quality product out of business. They couldn't compete. And that's the same kind of thing that's going to happen with the hamburger.
Right.
Or ground beef.
So eventually everybody's going to be grounding up beef hearts and putting them in hamburger. And in the past, this wasn't allowed.
That's, of course, and that's what it is. But they've changed the rules dramatically, and it's becoming more and more frightening to me. I think I've written extensively about it in my column. For anybody listening to this, go back and read some of my column. I talk about some of the things they do with our waste and everything else, and how I believe produce like spinach and stuff can get E. coli in it, and what happens, and how this happens, and it's not getting better. I read in the local paper, the Daily Advance, now that disease is getting worse and worse and worse, and that means they'll start using more and more antibiotics, and more antibiotics is not going to allow them to become ineffective after a while, and who knows how they're going to handle a pandemic.
Right.
I guess my pet peeve is that the folks who handle the food are probably the lowest paid employees in the workplace. Mm-hmm. I think that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Right. Well, one other thing you touched on this month's article that I think people would like to hear about was learning to read your own blood tests. So when you go to the doctor runs a test, and he comes back and he tells you, okay, you look good. But according to what you're saying, is a lot of times they don't have the time. They just skip through it real quick, and they say, okay, well, yeah, you look fine. And in this particular instance that happened to you, your PSAs were going up, and your doctor didn't mention it to you.
Right, because it was in the level that they thought was okay. I was in a study, the Select Cancer Study, at the time, and my PSAs were usually 0 or so forth and so on. It started going up. Now, they allow you up to 4. A 4 PSA is within the range. Mine was like 3.9, but we knew that there was something wrong, because prior to that, it was like 1. So what could have happened to throw it up those 3 percentage points? And that's my point about understanding your lab results, because you'd know, your doctor might not be able to recall or maybe even consider if the lab doesn't flag it, he might just dismiss it that it's okay when it might not be okay, and you might be getting an early warning of a problem.
Right. So say basically what you're saying is if you had had a baseline at one time, you had been looking at your reports, and all of a sudden you see your PSA jump to 3.9, you can say, oh, wow, I need to change my diet, or I need to change something to bring this down.
Exactly right. My glucose was a little high. Well, I know that means that I'm not processing carbohydrates properly. So I had to bring that down, maybe reduce my sugar, maybe, a whole lot, maybe stop sugar or stop this and that. And it's the same with my wife. And that was happening. It was happening to her at the same time. So I'm assuming that it was something in our diet we have to change. I'm of the opinion that everybody has to, if you get a diagnosis, you have to change something. The doctors will tell you, well, go ahead and do what you were doing. Well, what you were doing was probably the reason why you're ill.
Right.
Usually it's why you're ill. So what you want to do is adjust your lifestyle to mitigate the damage. Now I'm finding that our food is dirty. The food is dirty. And the industries is saying it. In fact, the USDA is saying it.
Right.
The USDA is saying more or less that organic, unless it's identified as certified organic, you're taking your chances.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you say that. You go into the store and you see these labelings that says, oh, this is organic, this is so much better for you, this is great. Well, what does that say about the other stuff on the shelf?
That's exactly right. I was stunned when one of the major food chains says, but that by the end of the year, our food will be clean.
Right.
That's a stunning statement. It's a stunning admission.
Yeah.
I mean, and I don't know how anybody interpret that as a food safety specialist. I interpreted it that the food is dirty now, and it'll be clean at the end of the year, which is what it is. Now, as far as organic is concerned, it's incredibly expensive because the demand is far exceeding the supply, and it's going to be that. That's why I'm promoting my initiative of the organic capital of the world in Northeast North Carolina, simply because Northeast North Carolina is in a unique position where it's the cost of getting organic produce there is astronomical. And now that the wages for those workers are going to go up, maybe the minimum wage at $15 an hour, I think that things like organic produce or produce in general has to be absorbed by the public, and it's going to be out of the reach of the people that need it most.
Well, that's one good thing about Northeast and North Carolina. Just about everything grows here. I believe that one of the farmers in Elizabeth City set the record for yield per acre of soybeans. So it tells you that this area can be a capital of produce. The farmers seem to be growing mostly corn and soybeans, and they're probably growing the quickest, most profitable thing they can. And as time goes on, I think more and more people are going to see that organic food is probably the way that we should all be eating, and maybe the farmers will start coming around to growing it around here.
Well, I don't know that the larger farmers, because they got a good market. I think it's a niche. The niche, like they call it specialty farming, and I believe that's the perfect vehicle, Northeast North Carolina, to get quality, wholesome food into the food chain here. Because for it to be transported, particularly the Northeast Pasco County and Elizabeth City, you have to actually go out of your way to come here. This can't be a destination. That should change when the interstate, and Elizabeth City will be an exit off the interstate. The new interstate is being proposed, I-87. That's down the road. But what happens now? Because to bring in organic, the shelf life, it's out of the way under any circumstances. Even the best, the logistics, the transportation links don't do well for here. But that also works for people who want to do business here, if you want to grow food here, the logistics are sensational. It lines up incredible, and it puts you in contact with 60 million customers, all up the East Coast. I will say this: organic produce is one of the fastest growing segments of agriculture in the world. In the United States, it went from the sales went from in 2005, 11 billion to 2015, 43 billion. And now companies like Walmart and Amazon are in the game. Whole Foods is feeling kind of, who started out with the organic thing. Now they're kind of concerned because other people now are getting into their market share. Well, when that happens, I think it's going to triple again in the next 10 years. That's a remarkable market.
Yeah. Well, we're almost out of time today. We'll have you back because you have some really interesting things that you've written about in the Albemarle Tradewinds magazine. And if anybody wants to read some of these older articles, you can go on albemarletradewinds.com, and down at the very bottom you can click on Warren Green. Warren writes some really interesting things, and we'll have you back on again. Thanks for being with us, Warren.
Well, thank you very much, Ken.